Hello and welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week we are finishing up the four Gospels with Matthew chapter 28, Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, and John chapters 20 and 21. This is it. This is the end of the four Gospels. And if you're like, I'm not sure what comes after that, make sure to grab your Big Picture Little Picture study guide. If you are a fan of Big Picture Monday videos, you will love the study guides. Absolutely you will. I have lots of people who tell me the same thing. If you want what's in Big Picture Mondays written down, that's what's in the study guide. I also give you bullet point lists of important people to know if you're ever like, I feel like I should know who Paul is. I give you information on that. Maps from the amazing Sarah at Olivet Designs so that you can picture what's going on in the book of Acts and all the epistles. I give you themes to look for if you're planning lessons. I give detailed chapter summaries so that you know what's happening. And then I give you 7 spiritual guiding questions so that you can write out and reflect and apply these questions every single week into your life. They are really awesome, if I do say so myself, but this is the week that the new study guide is starting. So this week ends in July, which is crazy. It starts the third quarter. So July through September is covered in my third quarter study guide. Great for individuals, but also families, also teenagers, a lot of teenagers. I used to teach 6th grade, so that's kind of what I'm used to. Like, that's my target audience are 6th graders. I don't write anything more complicated than what I think a 6th grader could handle. So youth of the church, absolutely as well. If you want a physical book, you can grab that from Amazon. The link is in my bio, or you can comment below and I'll send you the link. This will get shipped to you right away. Or if you want a digital download right now, head to my website, comefollowmestudy.com. You can download it and use it on your digital devices. You can share it with people in your household, or you can just print it on your own, like week by week, if you so desire. Okay, let's talk about this week, the happiest week of all time, because we get to talk about the resurrection, and what a refreshing thing to talk about, especially in regards to what we studied last week with the crucifixion and just kind of sitting in that sadness. Now we get to rejoice. Now we get to be so happy. This is the biggest miracle of all times. As you're reading through these 4 accounts, because of course, all 4 of the Gospels cover this account in the final chapter or chapters that they cover. You are going to see some differences though, heads up. And we're used to that. We're used to differences, but you are going to notice some differences. My advice to you on that would be look for the Joseph Smith translations in all of these chapters, because that will alleviate some of the differences, which is cool to see, like revelation on which account was actually right with some of the details, like how many angels were there and what were they doing at the tomb. Definitely check out the Joseph Smith translation for those. And then also some accounts cover certain events. If you're like picturing the Easter video in your mind or something like that, and you're like, wait, where? That's not in this account. Different things happen in different accounts. So just look for each one. Obviously, each author had their own details that they were including or that they weren't including. And so you'll kind of notice that as you go through. There's also a lot of people that are mentioned in this chapter. So if you have my study guide, head to the people to know section and just give yourself a quick reminder of who these people are, because there are quite a few that are mentioned, especially the women. So, but that's about it. This week, you guys know the story. You know the story for the most part. However, there are a few things as we're like wrapping up. I can almost hear the ending music being played in a video, right? It's like we had the climax and now we just have that little bit of wrapping up the storyline at the end to kind of tie up all the loose ends in our conclusion. And that's what we're getting this week. We get the climax and also tying up a few of the loose ends. So let's start kind of with what each author talks about in their chapter or chapters and what unique stories you can find in each of them. So starting in Matthew chapter 28, if you remember in Matthew 27 last week, I mentioned that the chief priests had been like, by the way, we think something fishy is going to go on with Jesus's tomb because everyone keeps saying that he's going to like rise from the dead. And so we need to put some soldiers out there. And so in Matthew 28, we kind of see the other end of that. So first, starting off, we have the women going to the tomb. And they see the angels opening the tomb, and the angels tell Mary Magdalene and the other Mary that Jesus has risen. And as they're running to go tell the other disciples, Jesus appears to these women, but he says that he still needs to ascend to the Father. Now, at this point, the chief priests catch wind of what's going on. These women are spreading the word, and the chief priests start their own rumor that the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus. So now they're covered. They've got their lie. They can spread that out as well. They've got their rumor going on. We then have the disciples meeting up at a mountain in Galilee, and Jesus appears to them in his full resurrected form, and the disciples all worship Jesus, and Jesus sends them forth to spread the word, to preach the gospel, and to bring people unto him. And that's it for the book of Matthew. It's like so many endings this week. It's crazy. Okay, now we're on to the book of Mark. Remember, Mark was kind of the more basic, he was probably the first one to write his gospel, maybe at the same time as John, but they weren't comparing notes at all. And so Mark, we have a shorter account in Mark chapter 16. This starts with Mary Magdalene and the other Mary and Salome going to the tomb. There's the angels. We have Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene and then to two others. And then we have Jesus appearing to all the disciples. He's telling them, preach the gospel. And then Jesus is received into heaven. Now, Luke, I hope you're kind of getting the idea at this point that Luke is a little bit different. There's a lot of different stories that Luke includes in his account, and that absolutely applies to Luke chapter 24. Remember, Luke, of course, has more medical terminology because he was a doctor, but he also seems to tell the stories of more women and just other minority groups, like poor individuals in society. He's telling their stories. So it's interesting to see Luke's account in chapter 24. We get the story of the women who have been waiting with their spices for the Sabbath day on Saturday to be over, right? That's why we don't have an account of what happened on Saturday, because they couldn't do anything with Jesus's body that day. So they go back on Sunday morning, first thing, they're ready with all their spices, and Jesus's body isn't there. Instead, there are two angels who tell them that Jesus has risen. And the women go to tell all the other disciples. Now, at this time, we also have a story of two disciples who were on the road to Emmaus. You may know this story, but someone joins them, and they're not able to tell who this person is at first, but they start talking. These two disciples start talking to the stranger on the road to Emmaus. Now, we know it is the risen Lord at this point, and the risen Lord in his disguise starts talking and asking these men what they know about Jesus, and he's prophesying and he's teaching them about the scriptures and what the Old Testament prophesied about. And these men want this individual to tarry with them longer, so they invite him into their home, and Jesus decides to give them a sacrament. He's breaking the bread and the water, and it's at this point that the men recognize who Jesus is, and he disappears. After this, we then get the account of Jesus appearing to all his disciples together. He invites them to touch his body, to feel of his wounds. And then they eat together, which is a really important thing to actually notice theologically, that we believe that Jesus, at this point, had his resurrected body and he was able to eat food. This is different than a spirit who has not been reunited with their body. So kind of cool little detail that's just sprinkled in there. And then we have the account of Jesus ascending back into heaven. Okay, last one, John chapter 20 and 21. Of course, John has different stories than everyone else as well, and it has 2 chapters. And I'll get to John 21. I think that's like a really great chapter to end off on. But John 20, let's start with where we're at. We have Mary Magdalene finding the empty tomb. And as she finds the empty tomb, she goes to tell Peter and John, and they run to come see the tomb as well. And everyone leaves to go back home at this point, very sad and sorrowful. They're not sure what happened. And Mary Magdalene is weeping, and Jesus appears to her. But he tells her that he has not ascended back to his Father yet. And so he goes away at this point, and then Jesus appears in his resurrected form to all of the disciples, and they're all together. He invites them to feel his hands and his feet, and then we get a story of so all the disciples are there except someone's missing, and that someone is Thomas, the apostle named Thomas. Yes, this is where he gets his name. We finally are getting to the story here at the end. Thomas isn't there, and so everyone's then filling in Thomas, like, you missed it. Jesus was resurrected. He had us feel his hands and his feet and the wounds. And Thomas doubts. Like, that seems like a pretty crazy story. He just does not believe. And then my favorite thing is that 8 days later, Jesus appears to Thomas and lets Thomas feel his hands and his feet, just like the other apostles. And then Thomas believes. So compassionate, so patient, so understanding. Oh man, Jesus is the best. Okay, final chapter, John chapter 21. I can now hear the credits rolling, right? We changed scenery. We're now at the Sea of Tiberias. We've got some apostles. They're out fishing on the boat. You know what I'm talking about, right? You can picture this scene. And they're fishing. They're not being successful. And this strange man comes to the shore. Of course, it's Jesus, but they can't tell that it is Jesus at this point. And he tells them to lower the net on the right side of the boat. And they do this, and it's filled with fish. And at this point, John, one of the apostles on the boats, is like, that's Jesus! And so everyone starts rowing in, but Peter jumps out of the boat and he starts swimming to shore. And there they are on the shore. Everyone's together. They're eating the fish and honeycomb together. Again, important to note that Jesus is eating food and they're having discussions. And this is where we end off of these 4 gospels of Jesus's mortal ministry with this beautiful conversation Jesus has with Peter, where he asks Peter if he loves him. And then he invites Peter to feed his sheep 3 different times. Beautiful invitation for Peter and all of us to follow. And then there is a little mention at the end of John 21 that John, the apostle, will not see death until Jesus comes again. Again, hinting at this idea that John was promised that he would not see death until Jesus' second coming. So we get a little hint of that at the end. Okay, that's it. That is our 4 gospels. That's what we learn about for Jesus's mortal ministry. This isn't my formal question, but I do just invite you guys this week to kind of ponder. We're at like halfway point in the calendar year. We're at the halfway point in Come Follow Me. We're at the halfway point of New Testament. Like, it's really just a great time to kind of stop and reflect how your life has changed this year studying Jesus. What have you learned about him, about what he says and does? How have you changed? Or maybe you haven't done as well as you've been hoping. And so what are some new goals you can now set for the second half of the year? Because you may be a little afraid of the book of Acts and all these epistles, and you may think, oh man, there's not that much great stuff here. Like, the 4 gospels are so good. But we study these chapters for a reason. There is so much good stuff left in the New Testament for us to study. There's 6 months worth of stuff, and I'm excited to dive into that as well. Okay, for my official focus question for this week, I have to do that ending invitation that Jesus gives to Peter. First of all, do we love Jesus? And secondly, if we do, feed his sheep. Of course, this applies to formal missionary work, but I think in different parts of our lives, what does this look like? Have I fed Jesus's sheep recently? Have I nourished someone? Have I blessed someone? In my stage of life right now, I think my biggest missionary moments are to my children. Am I teaching them the gospel? Am I nourishing them spiritually? Am I creating an environment where they're gonna know Jesus and know truths about him and know that their mom and their dad believe? Am I creating that environment? How am I feeding Jesus's sheep in that way? And then, of course, looking outside the home and people that I can reach out to, and friends and neighbors and ministering sisters and people in my ward. But how am I taking that commandment to love Jesus and then to feed his sheep as well? Okay, have a great week this week studying this beautiful Sabbath day Easter Sunday that we get to study all week long. And don't forget to grab your study guide, because this is the week that it all begins. You want to use every last page of it, so make sure to grab it right away and just feel really confident as we go into this next quarter. Okay, have a great week and happy studying.